Hello, everyone. Matt Desch here, and we've got a special conversation for you today. One of the fun parts of working at Iridium is learning about all the ways that our technology is used around the world. And in some cases, there's some really important stories that need to be told by those working to shine a light on some otherwise very uncomfortable subjects. So joining me today, as you can see, is an award-winning investigative journalist who writes for the New York Times, the New Yorker, the Atlantic, and more. Ian Urbina, thank you for joining me. I really appreciate you being here.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, most notably, Ian is the mind and ink behind the Outlaw Ocean series, which then became a best-selling novel of the same name, a music project, and most recently had a major feature story in the New Yorker. So I encourage all of you to check those things out. Ian's The Outlaw Ocean Project is today a nonprofit journalism organization focused on high-impact investigative stories, bringing needed attention to lawlessness at sea, an area, of course, that Iridium is very involved in and very, as our systems are used over all the oceans. And as such, we are very proud to support his efforts, and I'm honored to welcome him today. So, Ian, if you don't mind, I'd just get into a few questions for you here.
That'd be great.
So, the Outlaw Ocean Project has been a bit of a journey that has clearly been filled difficult situations. But if we can start by going back in time a bit, was there a particular moment in the early days of your investigations, say, I don't know, mid-2010s, I suppose, that you realized just how big a need there was to capture like the stories that you've been telling?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I mean, the reporting began at the New York Times in 2014. The series ran in 2015 in the newspaper. And so that, kind of 12, 24-month period was the first round of really intense reporting. And I think within 3 or 4 months of running around the globe and getting on ships, I saw just how invisible the workforce is, and how brutal the conditions are on many of, especially fishing boats. And then also just sort of the diversity of odd and seedy players that are out there, you know, repo men of the sea, or sea slavers, or arms traffickers, or oil dumpers, or it's just more of a diversity of characters than I had ever encountered on land. So, and then on the other hand, there were far fewer reporters than any other investigation we've done on land, because very few people go out to sea and spend time. So that sort of split, that void, is what attracted me to stick with it.
That's it's a heavily produced kind of view of the ocean, it seems like, from reality series and other things that we see. You've seen sort of all sides of it now. I guess, aside from the most recent experience that was shared in the New Yorker, which I'd like to get to in a moment, but are there any others that come to mind as being particularly difficult?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, Matt, I should just pause and say thank you to you and to Iridium, being a sort of protector technologically, of what I do, and the safety of my whole team. We couldn't do it without your help. I know you didn't want me to plug Iridium, but I do, need to thank you for having been with us for, a half decade. You know, the sort of sketchy, challenging situations tend to be in conflict zones. So Somalia, before Libya, I'd say that the sort of hairiest situation we got in was in Somalia, and specifically a breakaway state called Puntland, which is the actual Horn of Africa across from Yemen. And it's kind of like what Texas is to Washington, D.C., Puntland is to Mogadishu, in that it's part of the country, but there's a real cultural independence there. And in Puntland, a lot of arms trafficking and guerrillas that are fighting in Yemen launch from there. A lot of the piracy that you've heard about, and Captain Phillips piracy, launches from Puntland. So we went to Puntland, and Brazilian photographer and I, and began investigating some concerns off the coast of Puntland, and ended up falling out of favor with the local leaders, and sort of had our 20-man protection squad stripped from us, and we're stuck in Puntland with only two guys and kind of no way out. There were no ground transport. The only other Westerners at that time were at a CIA drone base, 20 miles away, and they couldn't really help us. And again, I had, my only mode of communication was an Iridium satellite phone. And as we hid out in the compound where we were staying, which was a sort of hotel, and we hid out on the roof, so that the hotel staff wouldn't know we were still there. Um, for a good 20 hours, we were completely unsure as to how we would make it out of the compound, much less the state. Obviously, we got out ultimately, but that was a pretty scary experience.
I'd say, and it's fascinating, the kind of thing, the issue, the things that you've seen and experienced. Thank you for the kind words with the team. Most of us don't get a chance to see what life is like for a lot of our customers in the ocean. I guess there's something like 56 million people that work, I guess, at sea. Obviously, most of them are in fishing. Obviously, we have seen things produce shows like Deadliest Catch and that sort of thing, but I imagine that's the exception versus what's really normal when you look at the world as a whole. What is the experience, if you can describe it, for most of those people out there on the oceans?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you think of the maritime space first, if you split it down in the middle, if you will, 1.2 million are in merchant marine. So these are carrying, oil, grain, Nike shoes, what have you, stuff. And then the other 53, 54 million are on fishing vessels. The near shore fishing vessels, those guys, and it's a mostly male world, go out for a day or a week at a time. The distant water fishing fleet is the really Dickensian, brutal, grinding, difficult work. Those boats sometimes stay out for over a year, sometimes 2 years. And the developing world, distant water fishing fleet. So poorer countries, the fishing fleets that are launching from those places, those are the boats that we really focus on, because that's where the real human rights, labor, environmental concerns most reside. You're not going to find the kinds of things I cover typically on a tuna vessel owned by Chicken of the Sea, a Western company, because they just have the money and the brand concern about avoiding sea slavery. But sort of other fleets, not so much, because they're off radar. So on that subsector of vessels, which is not a small number of people, you're dealing with hygienically just unfathomably dirty workplaces and living places. You're dealing with, I mean, if you imagine a ship as a factory, but this factory has as its floor skating rink slippery surface, right? So it's usually coated with fish guts that's stored up over a long time and can't really be washed away. So it's incredibly slippery. It's moving up and down like an elevator going up between 3 or 4 floors at all times. And it's sort of funhouse style. The floor is tipping and, so it's not staying horizontal. And then you're working 20-hour shifts with the intense stuff happening in the dead of night, because that's when you can catch the most fish. And you're working with sort of not OSHA approved machinery, if you know what I mean. In other words, these are huge machinery, spinning winches and huge industrial arms pulling, 10-ton nets that don't have any real protections on them. If that's the setting you're talking about, you can see why it's the most dangerous profession. So it's an unusually dangerous setting from a workplace standpoint. And then as a living space, it's incredibly dirty. Your skin never gets dry because you're wet all the time. And so you have a lot of cracking and cuts, and the possibility for infection is very high, and the boats don't tend to have medicine, and you can't go back to shore if you get an infection. Food poisoning is common. and it gets really severe. And so these sorts of things are other drivers of why the death rate tends to be very high on these boats.
But you've had to get on a lot of these ships to do your work. I mean, that must be a challenge. What is the challenge? I assume you don't just sign, you don't just get a ticket and get on these ships. And what about like these refugee rafts that you're on? I mean, how does the process differ on getting to these things to even work with you and your team?
Yeah, I mean, so um, we try to do all the stories with some portion of the reporting at sea. One of the few distinctions that we try to lean into are reporting, offshore. And so what that typically means is to get out into the space, you're typically going to have to go on either an advocacy vessel, so that's going to be Sea Shepherd or Greenpeace most likely, or one of these advocacy conservation groups, and they have huge boats that will be going out into space. Law enforcement vessels, so Coast Guard of the relevant country, and you convince them to take you out, or navies. Medical vessels, supply vessels that are, say, what are called motherships. They often go out to transshipment vessels that, fishing vessels that stay out there and keep shipping. So figuring out, knowing the different options for how to hitch a ride is step one. And then convincing the captains of those boats why they might want to help you is step two. And then once you get out into the space, getting onto the target vessel, that usually requires a good translator who can convince the captain on that vessel why it's safe and possibly even of interest to them to allow some photographer and journalist on board.
Amazing. But maybe jumping to this recent article and this amazing documentary that we just saw. They show a real diversity of people from all over the Middle East and Africa, but it seems like the one common denominator was, escaping a war-torn country, violence, human trafficking, other terrible situations. I'm
Mhm.
not sure we can all really appreciate this. These are pretty desperate people, aren't they?
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, as you said, so the recent reporting was a close look at the Mediterranean and sort of this phenomena that people have seen on the news, where especially since 2015, you've had tens of thousands of migrants who are crossing the Mediterranean from Libya, typically, and trying to make it to Europe. And so the investigation we did was taking a close look at why are so many people trying to cross the Mediterranean, and what efforts are being made to block them from making it across. Uh, Most of these migrants, as you said, are fleeing poverty and climate change. Sort of the repercussions of climate change. And some are also fleeing war and sort of terrorist organizations. Um, and a lot of them are getting blocked from making the trip across the Mediterranean by um, the Libyan Coast Guard, which is funded by the EU, and trying to keep them in Libya. Um, so, what we wanted to see was what happens when those people get turned back, and sort of what is the brutal reality within Libya, and specifically the prisons that they get sent to. So that's what we investigated.
Thanks for telling those stories. I mean, one of the things that struck me was just the consistent desire of the refugees to be able to communicate with family, let them know that they're okay. It seems to be like one of the first things people cared about other than just being alive, isn't it?
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, you better than anyone, I think, knows that we've all in the last decade, decade and a half, become quite um, reliant and sort of addicted to the assumption and the reality of staying in touch with each other. And that's as true for migrants, from a desperately poor village in Guinea-Bissau, and me in Washington D.C., or you in Virginia. Uh, and so, one of the, like you say, one of the really striking things is you can have these migrants coming from Eritrea, or Jordan, or South Africa, and they may not have a cent to their name, but they have a cell phone and they're fluent in using it, and they're sort of used to having the ability to communicate with each other, and so and that's one of the parts of the reporting we did for this investigation was a 5-week embed on a Doctors Without Borders ship on the Mediterranean that was there attempting to rescue migrants if they made it past the Libyan Coast Guard in international waters. And when the Doctors Without Borders folks would scoop up the migrants and bring them on shore, first they obviously attend to their medical needs, but then the next thing that all the migrants want to know is there internet? Like, do they have a way to, um, you know, um, make their brain feel whole now that their body has been put back in order? So that and there wasn't, and that was a real source of growing tension on the vessel, that the migrants were eager to tell their loved ones where they were, and to find out where they should be going if they did make it to the other side.
So satellite devices are I guess desired and wanted. I assume some of the few devices you had came in handy during some of those times as well, I would imagine.
Without a doubt. No, I mean, we always um I had a team with me of 4, and I have everyone who embeds with me that are really strict rules on wearing a tracking device, which is satellite, sort of a Garmin device. And then I also tend to have 2 Iridium phones that allow me to stay in voice communication with our security and my family and my editors.
Yeah, well, glad we can help keep you connected. But I'm just even fascinated. How do you mentally prepare to embark on these expeditions, knowing that, like in the past experience, you may end up making an unexpected stay in another country against your will? These aren't always safe situations.
Mhm. I mean, truth be told, I never think about the unexpected stay. It's happened a couple of times, and most brutally recently in Libya. But that doesn't tend to um, occupy my mind, because I try to do everything to prevent that from happening, even if I'm not always successful. The preparation, um, really, having done this for about 2 decades now, I've learned a lot, most especially from photographers, because they tend to be, often the ones who are going deepest into videographers and photographers. Us writers, we can call it in. Photographers cannot. They have to be in there to get the shot, and they tend to have really good tricks, for being a good traveler, in rough circumstances. And so I always try to pay attention to how my photographers pack and what they bring and why and which brands they use. And so my kit is pretty good now. And you know, I tr- dietary stuff is really important for me, because on a lot of these ships, you've got to make sure you're getting enough calories and the right kind of calories. Um, and then the tech is a huge part of I'd say 60% of what I pack tends to be tech. It's solar, energy sources, it's, Iridium phones, it's backup computers, batteries, it's all this sort of stuff so that I can capture and usually transmit. Because again, in Libya, for example, we were taken by a militia, as you now know, and all of our stuff was confiscated, and luckily, and ultimately destroyed by the militia. Well, luckily, I had a pretty strict policy on my team and on myself that the end of every reporting day we put stuff in the cloud. And so a huge amount of our footage, and the reason we were able to produce the New Yorker piece in the end, it was a shadow of its former self. We didn't have everything that we filmed, but we had a lot of it thanks to that policy and thanks to the technology that allowed us to be transmitting stuff into the cloud each day.
It's incredible. In that specific situation, how long was it before the authorities like realized who you were, and did that help or did it make it worse when they did?
Yeah, I mean, so the specifics were, we were taken by a militia in Libya, in Tripoli, and the militia, its official name and it's actually a part of the UN recognized government, but there are various militias that are part of the government. This militia went by the name of the Libyan Intelligence Service, and they had been tracking us and our reporting for the entire week we were doing the reporting, and we're not super thrilled with what we were working on, which was sort of abuse in these facilities, including murder. Um, so when they took me and my team, three of my team were actually, again, with security and a convoy headed to dinner. And I had stayed at the hotel because indeed I was supposed to put stuff up in the cloud and talk to my wife and get some work done. So I just said, no, I'm not going to go out. I got too much work. The militia came for me at the hotel room. 12, armed men, came into the room and hooded me, beat me for about an hour. My wife was on the phone with me and heard the beginning of it. So she immediately sprung into action. We had a security, plan that we had established, from prior trips and on this one. And so she reached out immediately to key folks in the U.S. State Department, and it's probably a big reason we're still alive, because that began right then. The militia took us. They took the other three in the middle of an intersection in a pretty coordinated hit. Hooded them, and we all ended up at a secret prison in Tripoli, where we were then held for the next 6 days and interrogated. They knew who everything about. They knew they had recording in our rooms that I heard. They knew everything about who we were. So there was no mystery to anyone involved who we were. In fact, who we were is probably why we got picked up, which is we were journalists in a country that didn't really want that kind of a story told. But luckily, U.S. State Department, White House, and the Dutch Foreign Service, I had a Dutch filmmaker with me, began applying pressure on the Libyan president and the Libyan attorney general. And after 6 days, finally, we were negotiated out.
Scary stuff. I think your wife deserves some awards there too.
Without a doubt.
Can see that.
Without a doubt.
Maybe on the lighter side, could you tell us a bit more about this Outlaw Ocean Music Project? Sounds like a combination of cultures there really delivers a unique soundtrack there that I just think people should check out.
Yeah, well, I appreciate it. No, it's one of my. It makes me very proud and happy. So this was an experiment in. I have a 17-year-old son, and I've been a journalist for 30 years, and he doesn't really read what I write, and that frustrates me. He's a smart kid and consumes a lot of information, but he gets a lot of his information from alternate platforms, TikTok and Facebook and Spotify and YouTube, and so the thought I had was, well, how do we get at younger people like him with stories like this, and at the New York Times, the sort of old school model was always, well, just do a better job at convincing them to come to your restaurant, like bring them to you, but do a better job at it. And in the age of Uber and sort of Amazon and sort of outreach, I thought, well, what if we took our stories out to where they are, whether they're a young person in Taiwan or Venezuela or the U.S. And so we thought, well, why don't we take one place where a lot of young people are in the millions is games, and another place is Spotify, is music platforms. And so what if we convince musicians, classical, hip hop, electronic, what have you, to partner with us, read the story, take sounds from the reporting, the video footage of the story, make an album in their own style, donate the album to us as a nonprofit, and then we'll publish the music on Spotify and we'll pair it with footage from the stories. And this was a crazy, weird idea that ended up working really well. And so now the Outlaw Ocean Music Project has, more than 500 musicians from 60 countries, 90 million listeners. And a lot of what's interesting is the streaming revenue from the music, some of it goes into the nonprofit, or 50% of it goes back to the musician, and 50% goes into the nonprofit to fund more stories. So that's a really neat thing. But we also get at, 2 out of every 10 listeners clicks over to the stories. And so we're getting a lot of reading traffic and viewing traffic that we wouldn't have otherwise accessed. and it's just neat to see your stories turn into music. The creativity that musicians bring is something that I kind of marvel at every album. So it's been great.
Fascinating. I really encourage people to check that out. What an interesting sort of angle that this grew into it. But I mean, the work that you've been doing is very, very important. Stories are amazing. I'm glad to see you home and safe here in DC, and probably yearning to get back out there, I imagine, to do something else dangerous and crazy. But we're really proud at Iridium to be able to support your mission and keeping you safe and you and your crew safe. And I'm just glad you could share a little time and energy with us to explain just how important this work is that you're doing. But thank you again, Ian, for joining me here today.
No, well, Matt, thank you, and thank you to Iridium for, again, all the support for so long.
All right, take care. Thanks everybody for joining us.